Western civilization is moving closer to a point of irreconcilable, unstable equilibrium, as frighteningly increasing numbers of people trust nothing. Media, academia, and especially the governments are no longer held in high esteem. Regaining trust is often impossible after betrayal. However, transparency is essential to any healing process, and that is the essence of the Don Sullivan Show. Please listen to the team explore, probe, and debate cutting-edge science, technology, and computing. Play ball! Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Don Sullivan Show, the show where we talk about everything science, technology, and computing on the level that your average, intelligent teenager, high school student can comprehend and consume. Today, we have a very interesting, very different type of show. But we have a guest who is a definite, hopefully, staple of the Don Sullivan Show, somebody who I have a great deal of respect for. You will remember him from our episode on Lake Clark National Park, our favorite bush pilot from Alaska, Mr. Ben Bunn. Say hello, Ben.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Stephen, you want to say hello? And Steve's here today. He won't be the next one, but say hello, Stephen, and let's talk for a little bit, and I'll get into the waiver.
I'm here at home. Greetings from the Garden State. Today's episode is brought to you by License Fortress, the industry's first and only software asset management firm to offer both a financial and legal guarantee at its highest level of service. Whether it's Oracle, Microsoft, or VMware, License Fortress helps organizations stay compliant, avoid audits, and save money. Learn more at licensefortress.com. And please support our producer by visiting axtinc.com. That's AXTINK.com. Subscribe to his YouTube channel and help support his efforts to create humorous animation and protect his house from two bumbling burglars using improvised traps and sheer determination. Back to you, Don.
Wait a minute, I thought he was the burglar. At last time he was the burglar in Vegas somewhere, no?
Maybe. Well, I mean...
Were they some of his friends? I don't know.
It's possible.
We gotta have
sometimes
him on
sometimes thieves steal from other thieves. It could be that.
Yeah, we got to have him on just to, show his bald head off one of these days. Oh, wait, we don't have video, though. I don't know. Okay. All right. So, folks, I have to read the waiver again. Here we go again. As you've all heard it many times, all statements by the host and the guest in the Don Sullivan Show are the personal opinions. And this really goes for today. Of all the guests and the host who all agree that the content is the property of his Analytics LLC to be used publicly and exclusively on the Don Sullivan Show. And even though you can't see it, as I just pointed out, everybody is shaking their heads in agreement, so we can go on and have a very, very interesting discussion. Today's discussion is going to be on a subject that is, some of you are going to, in a reactionary way, respond that it's not really science. But I think that we have to have an open mind. We have to understand where a lot of individuals are coming from in terms of what they consider science and how they think. And I simply want to have Ben talk about these notions, these ideas, and talk to us about how this is really definitely a science. That is the science of creationism or creation science. And Ben will definitely tell me about the proper terminology as we get into this. And I want to say again, Ben, welcome back to the show. You're certainly somebody who is, again, hopefully going to be on the show a lot over the years. And we want to have these discussions in the most open and honest possible way. So please, did I get anything wrong there? Tell me about the definition of creation science or the science of creationism.
Oh, I appreciate it, Don. Thanks for having me back again. And I think you're right on. I think that it is something that a lot of people don't attach the word science to, but I appreciate that you did, because I do think that there is a lot of evidence in science that does point towards creationism. And I think that when people can kind of step back and think about it with an open mind, then it can make a lot of sense. So I appreciate that. I like your definition.
And that's certainly what we do here on the Don Sullivan Show in terms of anything that follows proper scientific methods. And let me ask you this just to start with. Does creation science contradict? We'll get right into the heart of the matter here. Does it contradict what's commonly referred to as Darwinism or even the observation of natural selection? Are these two concepts that is creation science and natural selection, or even Darwinism in a greater sense, contradictory, or are they complementary?
I think that if you really do dig down deep to them, if you look at Darwinism in the sense of macroevolution and not microevolutionism, then they are contradictory. I don't think that one can look at creationism, at least in the sense that I see it, and factor in or be able to add into it macroevolution. And by macroevolution, most people probably know this, but macroevolution being evolution between species, microevolution being evolution within a species. So I think that there is definitely a need to omit macroevolution from creationism.
Okay, Ben, let me challenge you on this, because to most people this is a pretty, at least, controversial subject. Um, in fact, more often than not, the subject is referred to as a pseudoscience of some kind. But again, we at the Don Sullivan Show are committed to considering all arenas of thought that follow the scientific method of hypothesis, followed by rigorous testing and peer review. Eventually, that testing proves sufficient to be accepted as that hypothesis is accepted as a theory, and then 100, 200 years later, it's sort of codified as a law of science. And it takes a lot of work and understanding to it. So tell us why you believe creation science meets that criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, creation science, I look at that as a biblical explanation of creation science. And I think that one of the big things for me is looking at the Bible and trying to evaluate whether or not it is proven as a historical document that is true. And I think that there is a ton of evidence. I know that there is a ton of evidence for it being true. People are using it nowadays to make archaeological discoveries. They're using it as a roadmap in a sort of way, and pretty much every archaeological discovery has proven it to be true. When it comes to historical documents or copies of the Bible, we have thousands and thousands of copies of the Bible at a closer date to the actual events than any other historical document in the world. I mean, most people look at historical documents that they see as true history, and the truth is we probably have less than 10 copies of that document. But when it comes to the Bible, we have thousands of different fragments, thousands of copies of the Bible.
And I think
So
dating all the way back to the time of what is thought to be the Exodus,
yeah, all
Moses'
the way
time
back to
to,
within 100 years or so of the incidences that they're covering in the Bible. So I see a lot of validity in Scripture as it being true, and that leads some credence to it. But like you're saying, you have to have some sort of proof. You have to be able to look at it scientifically and find the proof of it. And I hold to a young Earth creation story because I think that matches Scripture the most. And if you start to pull away from Scripture and explain away things and try and work your own understanding into it, you start to move away from the validity of Scripture. You're saying, well, I know better. I'm going to trust it's true, except on this item. I'm going to say, well, this is what I believe, so I'm going to work that into my understanding of it somehow. So I look at Earth as a young Earth being somewhere around 10,000 years old. And I really do think that science has proven that. I think that archaeological finds prove that. I think that fossil records prove that. I think that there is a lot of evidence, if one is willing to really look and open your eyes to it, of, for example, the biblical flood. One of the really, really interesting facts that I just read about recently, pretty much every fossilized dinosaur that we have found has been in one of two positions, and nobody really knows why. But when it comes to the long-necked, what are those? The bronchiosauruses, the really long,
Brontosaurus,
yeah,
Brachiosauruses, Brachiosauruses, Ultrasauruses.
brachiosauruses.
Yeah.
Every single one of those fossils that we have found, they have been arched over head to tail, head almost touching tail like a big circle, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When an animal dies, it falls flat, right? And it lays down, and that's how it dies. And you would assume that that's how it would fossilize. And the other one is the dinosaurs with the big bone structure all across the back that weighs a lot. Those are all fossilized upside down. Pretty much every single one that we've found has been upside down, and every single long-necked and long-tailed has been in a big circle, curved over its back, arched over its back. And both of those are perfectly explained with the worldwide flood. If you have a dinosaur with all that weight on the back, all of a sudden in water, it's going to flip over upside down, and that's how it'll settle. And when it comes to the dinosaurs with the long necks and long tails, Bronchiosaurus, those have all that muscle structure built up across the top of its body from holding up that huge tail and that huge neck, that when you put it into water, all that muscle overcomes all of the weight that it doesn't have to pick up anymore, and the thing curls around into a big old circle across its back. And I think that there are a lot of other examples of the worldwide flood being true, and if that is true, then that pulls the dates way, way, way in closer than what common evolutionary theory states of the millions of years. And I do believe that the Earth is quite a bit younger, in the tens of thousands for sure.
Well, it's certainly plenty of evidence for a flood, at least in the areas of biblical reference, meaning the Middle East. The most likely scenario.
Atlantis isn't around anymore. And what is it? Who is it? Don, is it Grant? I forget his name. He's kind of an archaeologist, but like a pseudo. He can be portrayed as a pseudo archaeologist, but he talks about the Bimini Road or something like that.
Well, that's in the Bahamas, and that's a bunch of flat stones underneath the ocean that may or may not be a road. It's and if it is, it's probably due to a change in the sea levels. But there is real serious scientific understanding of the likelihood, at least in the Middle Eastern area of, or say Middle Europe, Eurasia, of some type of huge flood that happened post Younger Dryas, so 10,000 BC, at the end of the Younger Dryas period, when the sort of mini ice age, as they incorrectly call it, period of glacial maximum that occurred between about 13,000 and 10,000 BC, actually for about 1,500 years, so I'm overstating that. Likely, the Dardanelles straits were iced over, and that ice broke to some and at some point, and really created the Black Sea. And so that is an enormous amount of water, which would have lowered the sea level, at least at that point, throughout the entire world, and then also filled the Black Sea. So there probably was, large numbers of people in there. So at very least, even if it wasn't global, the occurrence of that flood, which does exist, at least mythologically, in every culture in the world.
Every single one. Yep.
Yeah. Well, it certainly could have, given the fact that we're talking about 10,000 BC, it could have been apocryphally transferred between the various different migrating tribes from that area throughout the world, given that was a time, the post-Younger Dryas time was a time of incredible world migration. But yes, it's there. It's just in every single culture in the world. There's some type of understanding of or apocryphal mythology of some kind of huge flood that happened.
Yeah.
But what about other specific biological examples? For instance, I know a lot of the argument is that we have never seen a species get created. I mean, the common fundamental biological thought is that 99% of species that ever existed on Earth have become extinct at some point, but we've never actually seen, we can obviously cause a species to become extinct, but we haven't seen at least animal species come into existence. But that really isn't, it's not a hard thing to do in labs. It's a dangerous thing to do, but it's a very common thing to experiment with and to try to create different organisms for different pharmacological reasons, for example, in labs from just by bacteria. So that could be done bacteriologically, but not, we haven't seen a new species get created. It's an animal species. So
yeah.
Does a liger count?
Does what count?
A liger. tiger and a lion mix.
I guess that doesn't
Well,
really count. That's
no.
like a mutt.
It's not okay. Let's define a species. A species has to be an animal that can reproduce, right? So, like a mule is a donkey and a horse, but the mules can't reproduce themselves, or even a beefalo is a cross between a cow and a bison, and they can't reproduce with themselves either. So that's where we're at. Once we see an animal that has been crossbred that can reproduce, that's a new species. So I'm sorry, Ben. Go ahead. We didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not
Tell
at
us.
all. Not at all. I think that you're right. I think that there is a lot of theory out there when it comes to evolutionism or Darwinism, but not a whole lot to back it up. Like you said, we don't really have any record of the 99% of species that have gone extinct, or even of the evolution between species. We don't have any record of that either. I watched a video on that old drawing that they used to have with the 9 figures from the ape to the human, and they were all the Homo erectus and the Homo sapien and the Homo this and the whatever. But even those, they've gone back now, and they said, well, okay, the first 5 of those are actually just monkeys, and the last 4 of those are actually just humans. And the gentleman that found the one in the middle has now admitted that he made massive modifications to the skeletal structure before turning it in, and we just don't have the evidence for it. We don't have the evidence to support that theory. And like you said, we can create new bacteria in a lab, but we're still just making bacteria from bacteria. We're not making fish from bacteria.
But they are new. They are new species in the sense of how I just defined it. That species is an entity. We think of them as animals, but that can reproduce with itself. Understand the difference between a virus, which really isn't life, which doesn't reproduce, it replicates, whereas bacteria, even an amoeba, a single-celled entity, does either through meiosis or mitosis, meaning sexual or asexually, reproduce. And so new species of bacteria using that definition I just mentioned do get created very commonly in, again, pharmacological experiments. Again, pretty dangerous stuff if you ask me, but we've had recent history of creating things that we shouldn't be.
And I think that there is the word that we can hone in on. They're created. They're intelligently designed, right? We're an intelligent being created. Well, not created. Created is a bad word, but developed them and made them. So,
well, in this case, the human being the intelligent
mm-hmm.
designer, as opposed to the Earth itself,
Mm-hmm.
or the universe itself.
Yeah. Yep. So I think that one of the other items that I look back on is the law that states, that nothing cannot create something, and something can't come out of nothing. And we take that as you could probably give that law a little bit better than I can. Can I get your help on that one?
Well, I mean, there is this notion from a perspective of some of the Big Bang Theory concepts of vacuum genesis, where as long as you have conservation of momentum and conservation of energy, you had matter and antimatter cause each other to exist. So that's where it starts at the very beginning, at least from a cosmological perspective.
Yeah,
So
from a theory.
yeah, going all the way back, 4.7 billion years ago, at
Yeah.
least in terms of cosmological redshift calculations.
What was before the Big Bang, though?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's what I go back to is, we know that there has to have been a start. Everyone kind of knows that there has to have been a start to all of this. And you can't have stuff come out of nothing. And that's a really interesting thing to then think about, that the natural law is that you can't make something out of nothing, which means to make all this something, you have to go to something unnatural. And that I think is where you can then bring in some theology, and that's where you start looking at the unnatural, and that is where I would say I'm firm on the side of creation, that we were created by a being that stands outside of all of this, outside of our understanding of space and time and all of that, and he was the one that created all of this. The natural had to have been made to come into being from nothing by something unnatural.
So why? I mean, I understand the sort of biblical confines of the principle here,
Hmm.
but in your mind, why does it have to be tens of thousands of years? Why couldn't it be tens of billions of years?
I would not hold that as a like pillar of my faith, of what I understand and what I believe. I do believe that, like I said, when we start to explain away things, and this is getting more into theology than into science, really.
That's fine.
Yeah,
Well, we're looking at the fundamental principles behind this, which has become an area of scientific thought.
yeah,
So please continue.
yeah. We're
Yeah.
getting into gray area, but when I look at scripture, I have to take scripture as being true, whether or not I understand what it says. And when people start explaining away what scripture says and trying to come to a different understanding than what it actually says, then you start losing the infallibility of scripture, and that I believe is a really rocky road and a really dangerous place to go theologically. So I always try and start from the perspective of, I believe what scripture says. Let's see if it's true, and I haven't found it to be proven untrue yet. So that's why I hold to a younger earth creationism, because when you do look at scripture, it's got a lot of genealogical information, especially in the Old Testament, a lot of ages. So you can actually go back and factor in with a degree of certainty what the age of earth would be according to scripture. And it's, in the tens of thousands.
So one of my favorite quotes, or even I'll paraphrase him, the great Carl Sagan from my time frame as a kid rather than you guys, when he in the 70s um, produced as the cosmologist of great fame the series Cosmos. He talked about how, at least in terms of common scientific, cosmological physics, and so on, how every atom in your body was created in a star, and not likely this star, meaning the sun, likely in some other star somewhere else, particularly anything that is on the periodic table above iron, because the star isn't big enough to have fused iron, and that the all of these random atoms have come together to create humanity. And the greatest accomplishment of the universe ever was to have created beings that had sentience so that it could ask questions about the origin of the universe. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it it to me is, and we're looking kind of at the difference between Sigmund Freud as an atheist versus Carl Jung um, as an extremely spiritual student of Freud's, and he wrote tremendously and eloquently and definitively about the observation of grace, and how grace simply was the the observational fact that more good things happened than bad things, and that the universe would be in total complete chaos in the absence of grace. And in a certain sense, I don't see that as being terribly contradictory to most of biblical or any religious understanding of reality. It just it's well, it's certainly different. It's a sort of different way of explaining everything, but I don't think it's completely contradictory. That's why I asked you right at the beginning: is it possible, at least in your mind, that the the scriptures themselves are written by less sophisticated people who understood science less than we understand now, and they wrote within the context of what they had to write with. Yet it's still accurate in their own context in that sense, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that, or a lot more. That's why I ask about billions of years versus thousands. The ultimate source is not that much different, is it? The ultimate cause.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at. I think that we have proven time and time again, even through scientific discovery, that the Bible does know more than we did. So I saw a really cool list that included a whole plethora of scientific statements that are in the Bible that you'd kind of glaze over and not really think about as a scientific statement, that contradicted what science said was true for years and years and years. And it was one of those items that they said, "Oh, the Bible can't be true because it says this, and science has proven this." But then at a later date, they were discovered to actually be false. The science was wrong, and that the Bible's statement, even though it was just a statement in Scripture that most people wouldn't take as science, was actually true. In fact, there's Scripture in the Bible that talks about the Earth being round. Science has proven that. When for a long, long time everyone said it was flat, and all the Bible's baloney because it says the Earth is round. That's ridiculous. The Bible talks about having fountains in the deep of the ocean. And for a long time, that was thought to be false. And now we do know, oh, actually, there are springs that come up out of the earth under the
The
ocean.
Mid Atlantic Ridge,
Yeah.
all of that,
Yeah.
5,000 miles,
Yeah.
10,000
So
miles.
I think that the Bible has contradicted what current science says, and time again has been found to be the truth above what current science says. So I love it every time I hear a scientist get up on a stage and say, "Oh, well, we now know," because because I never trust that. I never trust the "we now know" statements because 10 years ago they were saying, "Well, now we know," and now they're saying, "Oh, well, actually, now we know." And it just keeps going. So our understanding keeps developing. Absolutely, I think that we are gaining more and more knowledge as we grow as a species and as our understanding grows. But I look back at history and I see that the Bible has contradicted science over long periods of time and lots of items, and has always come out on top. And so I trust it. I trust it a lot.
So you would say that the commonly accepted, scientific, commonly accepted notions of since the Cambrian explosion, which is about 540 million years ago, in which life became abundant, there have been five major periods of mass extinctions. The most recent, of course, is when what's called the KT boundary, Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, although they've given it Paleogene, different name now, in which you are all around the world, just like the flood, all around the world, you can find this very pronounced layer at what is generally thought to be the 66 million year layer of iridium, which doesn't appear on Earth anywhere else. And that obviously is thought to have come from the body that crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula, causing the extent that last major extinction. So
Hmm.
you think that at this point, all of that is completely contradicted by scripture, or is there some way to reconcile these things?
I don't know. I don't know what the reconciliation would be, and honestly, I don't know enough about it to be able to give you information that would argue one way or the other for that.
Well, just as an example, the radiometric dating, as opposed to carbon dating, carbon dating is a form of radiometric dating that happens on a very, very short scale. So you're dealing with carbon 14 isotope that decays into carbon 12, and it's a very, very well known and observable period of decay from one isotope to the next. And that carbon 14 comes from magma in beneath the crust of the Earth. But the other radiometric datings, particularly with iridium and anything that's radioactive, or it's radiometric enough that it will, as everything is to some extent, it will that particular element will allows for isotopes of it that will decay. Again, they're pretty observable. But again, like I said, iridium and uranium, a number of others. Um, that the the rationalization of that, does that make any sense to you? Again, do you think that can be reconciled within the levels of Scripture itself? Do you see any place there that in some way alludes to that understanding of again observable chemistry and physics?
Hmm. Yeah, I have a hard time with carbon dating. I did a little bit of research into it for a while there when I was in college, and I think that we might be onto something with carbon dating, but we haven't figured it out. There are lots of instances of animals that were taken out of ice or out of the ground, and they carbon dated the skeletal structure, and then they carbon dated the skin, and the results were tens of thousands of years apart between the skin and the skeletal structure. Or I read a story about a gentleman who had a dog that died and he buried it in the backyard. A couple of years later, he thought it'd be interesting, so he dug it up, sent it to get carbon dated, and they carbon dated it in the hundreds of thousands of years old when it was his dog that he'd buried in his backyard. So I do think that there is some science there that we need to develop, but I don't think we've figured it out completely, and I have a hard time trusting the dates that they give us because of a lot of examples where it really fell short pretty massively. So I am interested in seeing how they develop that, but I think that the dates, we just haven't really proven them to be correct. It's
Well, it's just certainly you're right in that there is a lot of different flaws that can
a
occur,
lot. Yeah.
and it has to do with the environment something is buried in, particularly if there was burning around it that
Hmm.
of that particular carcass or some other biological entity that has died.
Yeah.
It relies on the idea that, for the most part, everything that's biological, when it's first comes into creation, for lack of a better word at this point, has a certain percentage of carbon 14 versus carbon 12. And when it dies, it was no more, it doesn't change at all except for um, the isotope decay. And if, for instance, there is different lots of different environmental factors, whether it be water, but mostly if it has to do with any kind of burning that occurs. So in that example that you just gave, I would suggest that a different sample from a different part of the dog probably needed to be tested, and that he may have even had a barbecue in his backyard that allowed for
They
carbon to get
cremated the
into.
dog before they buried
Yeah, well, not that it cremated the dog, but the carbon seeped through the earth on top of where the dog was buried, and therefore it contaminated the sample, and so on. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that the science itself has to be done extremely carefully and with a great deal of skepticism. I'll give you a perfect example. My father has always been had tremendous interest in the Shroud of Turin, and the Shroud, if the audience of the Don Sullivan Show
It's
doesn't
the one
know,
that
it was
has
thought
Jesus's face. He was wrapped
impression
in
on
it.
it,
Impression.
negative
Yeah.
impression.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the amazing part of it, it almost seems to be a negative from a photograph. And not that there weren't hundreds of thousands of people who were crucified and probably buried in that position at that time frame, but at one point about 15 years ago, the carbon dating was allowed by the church, and they dated it to around 400 BC, around 400 AD, and that disappointed my father tremendously because he really believed in it. But then the exact point I just made, it was determined that where the shroud was kept sometime during medieval periods in the church, there was a great fire in the church that it was kept in, which caused the shroud itself to become contaminated with smoke, burning wood of some kind from possibly that time period. And so the carbon dating on the shroud itself has been put off because they can't trust it. And of course, the church doesn't want it to, wants it to be from that period as well. But,
I'm
obviously there are a
surprised
lot of
they
different agendas.
like
Yeah.
is the church into I'm assuming this is the Roman Catholic Church you're talking about. Are
Yeah, of
they into
course.
carbon
It's the
dating?
Vatican.
Like, how do they
Well, yeah,
balance?
they absolutely they allowed for the sample to be taken after 20, 30 years of debating after dating was discovered in terms of a scientific approach. It took decades before they allowed it. Then they did allow it. They didn't get the result they wanted. They looked into history, found out that there was this fire in the church that was kept in, and then sort of disregarded all of the findings. But of course, they have an agenda, and I'm not saying one way or another where that falls in, but it perfectly fits in with your point, Ben, that there is a lot of questions to a lot of factors, a lot of questions that need to be asked about how the carbon dating process works. I think, however, the radiometric dating, you're talking about the spans of hundreds of thousands of years in terms of the isotopes of radium, Marie Curie gave her life to discover that, and uranium, and the different isotopes of uranium and others. They're understood on a scale of hundreds of thousands of years at least, and that's why I'm just saying that I think that there is a way to reconcile, and there is a way to to understand that the fundamental points in Scripture are likely complementary to what we are seeing in science. Particularly, I'm a big fan of Carl Jung, as you've already probably ascertained, in regards to the way he thinks along these lines. Um, what about cosmology? So let's get into that for a minute. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on Big Bang, and you would know that in the 60s there was a number of different, 60s on back, there were a number of different theories of cosmological creation. The steady state theory, the Big Bang theory, and a few others. It pretty much settled on the Big Bang, which is contradictory to something you said before. You can't create something from nothing. Of course, now you get into all kinds of interesting notions from various different general relativity ideas that
God does not play
allow
dice.
for
That was that.
multiverses and so on. Yeah.
That famous
But
quote from
so
Einstein.
so where does yeah, well, God does not make mistakes, right? That's and God does not play dice. That's right. When that was Einstein, somewhat skeptical of Niels Bohr's um, putting together the the physics of quantum physics from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and some other things. And Einstein was very uncomfortable with it, but he, of course, um, refuted that later in his life. But now, what I'm really thinking of is this. I want to hear from you, Ben. So I'll shut up here. What about the Big Bang ideas 4.7 billion years ago, at least in terms of cosmological redshift and so on? Where do you fall in on that? Where do you think the ideas of creation science fall in on that?
Um, I mean, we're getting to the point where we really don't have a way to prove completely one way or the other scientifically because we can't look back that far. And I can tell you what I believe, and it's going to probably be contrary to what most of your listeners are going to believe, but I don't believe in the Big Bang. I don't think that all of this stuff originated from one single point. And again, you still then have the question of, okay, well then where did all of that material come from? Because it had to be from
Yeah,
somewhere. So
absolutely, you do.
I don't believe in the Big Bang. I think that there is too much um, order and purposefulness in this world for it to just be happenstance. I'm sure you've seen, the statistical numbers. What's the statistics of a planet just happening to be in the Goldilocks zone? And then what's the statistical probability of, the planet being the right size to be able to hold in oxygen and water and all this stuff for life to be able to form. And I think that statistically, it's just a complete impossibility
Well,
for
that was
this world.
Young's idea of grace.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that. I like that. I think that there is a lot of grace from God in this world, that He keeps this world going. Um, I don't. And again, this is going to be getting into theology. I'm not gonna have science to really back it up. I don't think that science really has a way to prove the opposite completely either. So we're all kind of getting into theories, which theory do we believe more? But I don't believe in the Big Bang. I don't believe in the old Earth. I think that the Earth is quite young there compared to the Big Bang and most evolutionism. And I think that when God created the world, he created it all as it is pretty close to right now. And that we started from that point. Whether it was an old Earth creationism or a young Earth, that part I don't know. I'll leave that to smarter men than me. I'm just a bush pilot, man.
Oh, you're a lot more than that, my friend. But I'll give you one example that's interesting. Ann Coulter, you might have heard of her. She's certainly like Tucker and like some others, she lives on antagonistic hyperbole, but she is also to a certain extent, a believer in biblical creationism.
Hmm.
I'm not sure to what extent, but I have read a lot of her books and a lot of her thoughts. She is extremely powerful thinker, despite her levels of controversy. One of the examples I've heard her use is the example of the platypus. From a perspective of, you mentioned the Goldilocks zone, the exact perfect circumstances that were necessary to create life
Hmm.
and to create us is statistically highly unlikely at very least. But Anne uses, and I've heard her use the term or the example of the platypus being there being no animals that are anywhere near anything that could possibly rationalize the existence of a platypus. It had to have been
A
created
weird
on
animal.
its own,
It is a
yeah,
weird
as a
animal.
separate entity. Now, I don't know if I buy that.
Are they
Just because we
poisonous?
haven't discovered it
They
yet
do. They
doesn't
have
mean it
a they
doesn't
have a
exist.
poisonous little
Yeah,
stinger. Yeah, isn't that
Yeah,
weird?
they have a stinger too. It's like a bee,
Yep.
a
they're
duck, and a
incredible to look at
seal,
them.
and yeah,
And a
it's
bee all in one. That
yeah, it's
animal tells
crazy.
me that God has a sense of humor, is what that tells me.
Okay, yeah, it's that's good to know. That's really good to know. I think he was laughing at me yesterday when I was doing another episode that we will see in a couple of weeks. But I shouldn't say he. I suppose people get mad at me, would they, Stephen? But let me ask you this, Ben.
That's a
As
whole
we're getting
nother
close
debate.
to the
That is.
yeah, so we're getting close to the hour. Tell me, do you think creation science or creationism or intelligent design is gaining in popularity, or is it in stasis, or is it in less than, say, maybe 10 years ago when you were first in your formative years?
I definitely think it is gaining in popularity. I think that we're gaining a lot of extremely intelligent people that are scientific in their background and are very well studied and well versed and good speakers. And then you add in social media and the way that we can get information in a second right at our fingertips at any time. And that there's a lot of really, really good information being passed from much smarter people than me. And I think that has swayed the minds of a lot of people towards creationism. I think that the more science develops, the more of a hard time we have with evolutionism, with, Darwinism, in the sense of macroevolution. And the more we kind of delve and the more we see and the more we study, the more and more unlikely it gets. So I do think that creationism is growing. I would say rightly so, but that's a personal preference. And
Well, I'm asking you for your observation too. Are
yeah,
you seeing more? Yeah.
yeah, and I do think that science is going to keep proving it correctly. Science is going to keep proving Scripture is correct, and that the further along we get in knowledge, the closer and closer those two will get, science and Scripture.
So we're coming sort of to an end here, Ben and Steve. But Ben, you're an incredible human being, as I observed myself in Alaska. You're more than a bush pilot. You've got natural instincts of heroism. If I had to be stuck in Alaska next year for a couple of weeks, and I had one person that I needed to be with me to help me survive, it would absolutely be you.
I
So I'd like you
appreciate
to end
that.
this up and tell me, do you have any final thoughts? Anything that we have skipped here that you'd like to add in?
Um, I would just encourage people, if this is the first time that you've heard this, or if this has maybe brought you some questions that you're interested in, my encouragement to you would just be to go to the source. And if you've always kind of sat on the side of evolutionism or Darwinism and you want to know more, read some scripture. Go read it. Just get it straight from the donkey's mouth instead of watching videos or something like that. I think that it can be misrepresented by people and represented really well by others, but that's a lot of sifting to do. So I would just encourage people to ask questions and go do some digging for yourself. It's easy to get force-fed information and then just regurgitate what you've heard from this guy or this Instagram video or that TikTok. But to actually go and do your own digging, I'll never discourage that, because it develops you as a person, develops you mentally, and I would argue will get you the best results. So just encourage people to go read, go do some digging.
It's funny. You mentioned all of these various different applications and the internet and so on. I'm of such a different time frame. I didn't even have email until I had about 3 degrees. So it's like,
Well, you know what? You don't necessarily think of, religion and the church within the context of, modernity, but actually social media is I think it's a major wellspring of religious ideas, of all ideas for that
of all
matter.
ideas, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But this was fascinating. I'm not a particularly religious person. I'm not particularly scientific either. I will say though, when I've been in some situations in life when the chips are kind of down, like I'm not saying a prayer to the Big Bang. It's kind of like,
Yep.
oh, so
Yep.
I will admit as much.
Well, Stephen, Ben, on that thought, Steve, you want to take us out? You got anything to add in here?
Well, I don't want to take us on tangents. I was going to ask, but you know what? It would be tangential to the discussion, so I will
All
save
right,
it for
maybe for
next
another,
time.
maybe for another show, because we're definitely going to ask Ben to come back. And if you learn other things, Ben, or if your thinking evolves on this, or if you want to bring somebody else on, we're certainly open to it here on the Don Sullivan Show. So I invite you to come back.
I appreciate that. I would really like to. Stephen, maybe you pose the question as a teaser for our next
I think so.
video.
Yeah, that's
All
not
right,
a bad
folks.
idea. That's not. Yep.
Folks, as always, there is something I have to mention. Whether we're climbing mountains, or we're going to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, or we're discussing whether the universe is 14 billion years old, or a couple of thousand years old, or 10,000 years old. Remember, the one philosophy I go by, and I'll always believe in the validity of thinking along these lines, that all at bats are situational. Thanks, and see you till next time.